Welcome to CMT's raised panel door video. I'm Cliffe and I'm going to be your host and demonstrator throughout this video. I'm real pleased to do this tape and I'm happy to show you all of the things that go into making a raised panel door. Watch carefully and don't forget you can rewind anytime you want to see the same scene again and again. Also, think about your work. Work safely and work smart. Wear your hearing protection, use barrier guards on all of your machines. You'll see every setup that we've used, we've set up some form of guarding to make the job safer. Always chuck at least 1 inch of your bit into the collet of your routers and make sure it's locked securely. Check them periodically. Work smart, work safe, and don't take chances. Well, here we go. First, I'd like to give you a little terminology and a little orientation so you'll be better prepared to make nice doors on your first attempt. I prepared some of the parts here on the bench and I thought I'd speak to those, naming the parts and then naming the cuts. If you were to look at this door in its actual position, vertically oriented like this, obviously the other two parts would be in place, we actually have 3 parts. The lower and upper piece that would be here are the rails. They run parallel to the railroad and that's the easiest way to remember those names. The vertical pieces are the stiles, S-T-I-L-E. These pieces are a little different in the profiles and cuts, and we'll talk about the cuts and what bits to use in just a minute. The center portion is the panel. Most people choose to make a solid wood raised panel, while others will use a plywood panel. You can use either, but the set of bits that we'll be using today will allow us to make this raised panel. Now, a little bit about the profiles and the cuts. The rail has actually 2 cuts on it. The end grain has what we call a cope cut on it. And if you've ever heard of a coping saw, you know it cuts a profile that fits something else. This profile fits the mating cut, which is the stick or rail edge cut. The rail edge cut is an exact mirror image, and in fact if you look at this groove it matches up with the tongue. And that's one of the first tips I'll offer you as far as setup. When we set up the cutters, we use one to set up the other just by positioning the tongue. Alright, so those are the 2 cuts that you'll find on the rails. How about the stile? The stile has an edge cut on it, which is the same as the one cut on the rail. Now, this edge cut is identical, and when we push the 2 together, we get what looks like a perfect miter. Except they're not mitered, one covers the other, which means as this expands and contracts, the miter always looks exactly the same, unlike a typical miter joint where you might have some movement and a gap there. So the design of this door is really nice. You also see that as you look into the door, we have a feeling of depth and beauty. And that's the whole procedure or whole approach to what we're doing here, to give that door depth and beauty. Let me now direct your attention to the bits that give you this depth and beauty, the CMT router bits. We actually have 3 bits here that we're going to be talking about in the video, and some of them that we'll see in the video are first the cope cutter, then the stick cutter, this does the edges, this does the end grain, and then the panel cutter. Now this is a horizontal panel cutter. If you've looked at your catalog, you may have seen both the horizontal and the vertical. We'll be using the horizontal here, and the reason we'll be using it is it allows us to get a little deeper cut with less deflection. One thing that we have to have though is control of our speed. We can't use a high RPM router. We should use something that runs at about 10 or 12,000 RPMs to run a bit this large, and we'll be set up to do that in this video. Let me direct your attention over here to help you see a little bit about what's happening in a little larger drawing or diagram. The stick cutter, that would be this one here, cuts the edge of the rail and stile. The cope cuts the end of the rail. So 2 ends of the rails will have a cope cut on them, and the inside edge of all of the parts will have the stick cut on them. Now the stick is an edge, the cope is an end, and that might be one way of trying to orient yourself as we go through this. Terminology can be confusing, so don't hesitate to rewind or jot down a note as we go through this, because we're going to use the terminology the best way we know how. Now, we're set up right now to cut this stick or edge over at the router table, and I'm going to go over there now, and I'll meet you over there and we'll plan this out and I'll demonstrate all of the things that you need to know about that. So I'll meet you over there in just a second. I'm set up to do the stick cut or the edge cut on all 4 parts of the door. I'm using a Delta router shaper, which is set to run at about 10,000 RPM. So it's a good choice. The speed is about right for all three operations. Could be a little faster for the cope and stick, but it'll be ideal for raising the panel. So we're going to go with that. I've set up my stick cutter, and notice that I have some feather boards here to hold my stock in and down. Now, the cut is set up so that the good face of the wood is down. Notice that I've sanded this real well. That's going to be my good face. There's a few mill marks here. So I've oriented all four parts of the door just that way. And if I were to look at these parts, I'd say, is there an edge that I want to route more than another? For example, if there was some kind of figure that I could cut out or something of that nature or something I'm looking for, I could plan ahead. Everything looks good. I'm going to just set them down so that as I pick them up, they will be fed through here in this fashion. And notice that those feathers are actually grabbing on the board and holding. I've made a specialized push stick which will allow me to feed this through, keep my hands out of the area. One other thing I want to point out to you is I've added dust collection, and I think it's very important that you have dust collection with any of these cuts. Another thing about the setup, notice that the fences are very, very close to the bit. They're not going to touch it, but they're very close. This reduces the amount of tear out and also keeps you in control. That's the things that we're after as we make this cut. So let's set that up. I'm going to fire it up, put on the dust collector, and make the 4 cuts, and you can just watch and see how it's done. Well, there's the parts of the first cut on them. A couple of things more that are very important here. I've set it so that there's 1/8 inch of wood down here. That means that if I have a 5/8 inch panel, when I put it in, the top of the panel will be even with the top of the door. That's part of the strategy and part of the positioning. One other thing that I didn't tell you that you might have noticed as the pieces were going through, they not only touched both fences, but the ball bearing on top of the cutter was also rolling, telling you that they're all three in the same plane. That's part of the setup and part of the strategy that you need to employ when making this cut. Well, that's all we really need to do here. That's the first setup. We've got the rails and stiles cut. Now, one of the things we're going to do, remember we're only doing the rail ends on 2 of these pieces. These would be the stiles or vertical pieces. These are the rails or horizontal pieces. I'm going to leave them out, and I'm going to take these away. Since I don't want to cut these, the best thing to do is move them away from the operation, don't you suppose? All right, I'll leave these here, and I'm going to change the setup. When I come back, we'll be ready to make that cut. Be back in just a minute. We've got a cope set up now, and remember we've made 1 cut on it already. We've got our good face down, and I want to show you a little something I've made up. I've got an L-shaped block with another piece for tear out. If you look through here, you'll see that that's going to back up the cut when the bit comes around, thus reducing the chance of tear out on the piece. Now, the good face is down, and you may have heard the expression, the tail wags the dog, and to a certain extent it does, because if I were to bring this piece over here and line it up, you'll notice that that groove lines up with the open space there, which tells me that a tongue will be cut to match it perfectly. Now, we could measure this, but unfortunately our eyes aren't usually that good, and believe it or not, some people make measuring errors. So we're going to eliminate that by setting it up this way. Now, one other thing that I've done is I've put a clamping mechanism on here to hold this piece. There is a tendency for the end grain to be sucked in or creep toward the cutter. We've got a ball bearing in the middle of the cutter lined up with these two fences. So we've got a very small opening, and again, that's very important to cope or make the opening as small as possible. We've got a barrier guard that will set in place shortly. One other thing about this piece of plywood, since the good face is down, when I put it on here and it rides across here, it's not going to get scuffed up. So that's a benefit too. All right, so I've got to do both ends of both rails with the cope cut, and I'm set to do that. I'll turn on the dust collector, make those cuts, and show them to you. Now, if we were to slip these together, the fit's exactly as we want. There is a little bit of rolling and tear out here. Is that going to be a problem? I don't think so, because generally what I do is I take a sharp utility knife and just cut down there lightly. Once I've done that, the tear out will go away. Now, we've got a good fit there. That's exactly what we want. All we've got to do is make those cuts on the mating parts, and we'll have the frame done. Once we have the frame done, we can take the dimensions so we know what size to make the raised panel, which will be the third step in the sequence. So I'm getting ready to make that panel. I'll set these up, measure them. I'll come back with the right size panel, and we'll make a raised panel. I'll meet you back here in just a minute. See you then. Things have changed a little bit here at the router table, and we've got a much larger bit. Remember, tip speed was an important issue. This runs at about 10,000 RPM, so I'm quite satisfied that we're going to run safely. If you're using a router in your table, make sure you can dial that down. You don't want to be running at high RPMs. A couple of other issues come to mind here. First of all, I put an auxiliary fence on here, and the reason I did is I wanted to cope or cut closely the opening in the fence to the cutter. That way I've got control over my piece. This ball bearing on the cutter lines up with this auxiliary face I put on. Now, if I'm going to use the miter slot, I have to be parallel to it, and I'm going to offer you this little tip. I've got a little cleat on here that drops into the miter slot. This angle, this is the exact same angle, and it's just like a pair of shim shingles. That tells me whether my fence is indeed parallel to the miter slot. It is, and I'm satisfied that it is. This now is a 1/2 inch. It's a little higher than half. I'm going to set this over the path of the cutter, and this will be my barrier guard. And all I've got to do is clamp this in position. Now, it's a good idea to have a barrier guard on your cutter. In fact, I rarely work without anything like this unless I've got some other type of safety device to work with as a feeder. And I thought I'd share with you two methods, and this is the first of them. So I'll get this in position. Satisfied that's snug. I'll take these out of here now. We won't need those. Set them aside. This will be the panel, and I've got the face, the good face, prepared, and I just want to check, will it go through without binding? Yes, it will, so I'm satisfied there. I mentioned I'll be using a miter gauge to control this. This miter gauge has one unique feature, and that is a clamping mechanism that allows me to clamp this. Well, I could pull this away slightly and clamp it like so. If I did, I would be taking a light cut, then I could move in. Generally, I do the end grain first. I could do the end grain and go all the way around, and then the tear out would be picked up as I went. Either of these approaches is good. Once again, dust collection is important. Everything's clamped, everything's solid, and that's one of those checks you want to make sure of before you get involved. You don't want to have something come loose on you in an operation like this. Now, this is a 5/8 panel, and I talked about this earlier, that this is what I typically work with, and I've got this set, so when it's raised, I'll have my 1/4 inch edge on here to fit that kerf. If you're working with 3/4, you might have to make a backing cut on that, and we'll talk about that when we get to assembly. All right, so I'm satisfied this is going to work. I'm going to make a demonstration cut of a light cut, and then I'll go back and pick up the other cut. This will give you an idea of exactly what needs to be done, and then I'll do an entire panel for you. Now we've got a nice cut on the edge, a nice flat that'll fit in our groove. I'm real happy with what I have here. Now you notice I made 2 cuts by going in. Another way to do that would be to lower that panel raising cutter and then raise it for a second cut. Both of those are appropriate approaches. Now let's go to the bench and assemble those parts into a nice fitting door. Well, I've laid out the parts here and I'm ready to assemble. I've got my 5/8 panel, my 2 rails, and my 2 stiles all set up just as they would be assembled. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this up on edge, and I've got some yellow glue here. I'm going to brush it on, and I'm going to be careful not to get it too close to this edge because I don't want it squeezing out into the actual door once it's assembled. So I'll brush that on, and I'll just set this in close to where it needs to be as possible. Brush it on the other one. Again, try to keep it away from that edge. You don't want a little bit of fuzz in there. I'm going to pull that out of there right now. There we go. Set that in position. Next, I'll drop the panel in, and the raised side is toward me because that's the decorative side. Push that down like so. Once I've got it set where I want it, notice I'm very careful not to get any glue on the panel. That panel has to stay in there and it has to move freely. And that's what I want you to think about when you put these together. Don't get any glue on that panel. If you do, it might expand and actually break the joinery in the corners. And that's not what we want. Also notice that the panel is about 1/8 inch lower than the 2 tenons extending out. That's good. The reason that is good is the panel is free to expand and contract, and with its size, 1/8 should be an adequate allowance for that. Okay, I've got my glue in. Bring the other piece up. Slip it in so it's together. Try not to get any glue on my hands because you know where that'll end up, don't you? Now, sometimes we have to persuade things a little bit. You get a good tight joint, such as with the CMT bits, that's what you can expect. Tap down on that to line it up. Tap that to line the corners up. This corner here is extending up a bit. I need to drive it down so I can use that shoulder there, like so. One more time. Okay, the joints are open a little bit, but everything's positioned correctly, so I'm not going to worry about it. these clamps have to be in a true plane, because if they're not, you could actually put a warp into the door. So I'm going to bring that in, ease that clamp up, and I'm watching that joint. It's starting to close up, and I'll bring this other one over now and start working the other side. Everything's in alignment. Squeeze down, clamp there, squeeze down, and I've clamped there. Now everything is nice and snug all the way around, and that's as it should be. That's what we expect with these CMT bits. We get the high quality fit right out of the box. Now, what I'd like to do is direct your attention to this panel. This panel too has been raised, but it's a 3/4 inch thickness as opposed to the 5/8. The 5/8 with a 1/8 inch notch on the back, or rabbet, gives me a nice even front. This panel would actually stick up about 1/8. So to eliminate that, I chose to use the CMT bowl and tray bit, which is a nice flat with a radius. And you can see the kind of cut you would get as you bring this around. This relieves the back, so this panel will actually drop down and the front will be even with the rails and stiles. Now, you could actually not do this and the panel would stick up, but not everybody likes that, and this is considered standard practice. So if you're working with 3/4, you can back cut it either with this or with the CMT rabbeting bit, whichever is your choice. In any case, that's the technique that you need to employ. Review the tape before you start cutting your wood. Cut some extra wood and make some setup blocks. It'll be the best thing you can do. Not only studying woodworking, but doing woodworking makes you a better woodworker. So do more woodworking, and I hope to see you on another video. Thanks for watching.